It was a calm Tuesday morning in Brookville, a city known for its tree-lined streets and bustling downtown. Officer Daniels, a seasoned policeman with over 10 years of experience, was out on his routine patrol. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a golden glow over the neighborhood. It was supposed to be a quiet day, just like any other. Driving his cruiser through an upscale residential area, Daniels noticed a black woman stepping out of a car and walking toward a large house. She carried a briefcase and wore casual clothing, which caught his attention. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Who would be carrying a briefcase here this early? He muttered to himself. The thought lingered as he slowed down, watching her disappear into the house. Serena Clark, the woman in question, was on official business. She was the city's newly elected mayor, but her attire and demeanor were far from what most people associated with someone of her stature. She had come to meet a community leader to discuss a pressing issue: housing reform in one of the city's most divided neighborhoods. Dressed in comfortable slacks and a light sweater, Serena prioritized connecting with people over formal appearances. Daniels parked his car a few houses away and stepped out. Something about the situation didn't sit right with him, and he decided to investigate further. As Serena came back outside to retrieve additional documents from her car, Daniels approached her. "Excuse me, ma'am," he called out, his tone firm but not aggressive. Serena turned to face him, raising an eyebrow at the officer standing before her. "Yes," she replied, her voice calm but curious. Daniels took a step closer, his hand resting lightly on his belt. "May I ask what you're doing here?" Serena blinked, slightly taken aback. "I'm here for a meeting," she said simply, gesturing toward the house. "I don't see why that's a problem." Daniels wasn't satisfied with the answer. "A meeting this early in the morning? Do you live here, ma'am?" His tone carried an edge now, and Serena noticed it. She straightened her posture, meeting his gaze. "No, I don't live here," she replied firmly. "But I was invited. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to get back to my meeting." Her calm demeanor seemed to irritate Daniels. He pressed on. "Can you prove that you were invited? Do you have any identification?" Serena sighed, reaching into her pocket to pull out her ID. "Here," she said, handing it over. "This should answer your questions." Daniels glanced at the ID but didn't take the time to read it thoroughly. His suspicion clouded his judgment, and he dismissed it quickly. "I'll need to verify this," he said, pocketing the card. Serena frowned, her patience wearing thin. "Officer, I don't think you understand who I am," she said firmly. But Daniels wasn't listening. He was convinced there was more to the situation than she was letting on. As a small crowd of neighbors began to gather, Daniels continued his questioning. Serena, now visibly frustrated, tried to maintain her composure. "Officer, I've explained myself. Either let me go or check with the homeowner. This is unnecessary." But Daniels wasn't ready to back down. In his mind, he was doing his duty, but in reality, he was making a grave mistake. The stage was set for a confrontation that neither of them would forget. The tension grew as Officer Daniels continued questioning Serena. By now, a few neighbors had started to watch from their windows and driveways, curious about what was unfolding. Serena, standing tall and calm, could feel the weight of their stares but refused to let it intimidate her. She was no stranger to difficult situations, but this encounter felt different. "Officer, I have already told you why I am here," she said, her voice steady. "If you need more information, I suggest you call the homeowner. They'll confirm everything." Daniels, however, wasn't convinced. His instincts told him something was off, but he wasn't taking the time to actually consider the evidence in front of him. He took a step closer, his posture more commanding. "Ma'am, I need you to stay where you are while I verify your story," he said. Serena crossed her arms, exhaling deeply. "Fine," she replied, though her patience was wearing thin. "But let me be very clear. You're wasting time here, officer." Daniels ignored her comment and radioed in for backup, asking for confirmation about the car's registration and any potential complaints in the area. Serena watched him carefully, noting how quickly he had escalated a simple misunderstanding. "You're really going through all of this for nothing," she muttered under her breath. Minutes later, a second patrol car pulled up. Another officer stepped out, looking between Daniels and Serena with a curious expression. "What's going on here?" the new officer asked. Daniels pointed toward Serena. "Suspicious activity," he said curtly. "She claims she's here for a meeting, but I'm verifying her story." The second officer glanced at Serena, who stood calmly but with an air of authority that was hard to ignore. Something about her demeanor made him hesitate. "Do you have any identification?" he asked politely. "I already gave it to him," Serena said, gesturing to Daniels. It seems he didn't bother to actually read it. Daniels shot her a look but didn't respond. The second officer turned to Daniels. "Did you check her ID?" he asked. "Yes, but I wanted to confirm the details," Daniels replied, sounding defensive. The second officer frowned slightly and asked to see the ID. When Daniels handed it over, the new officer's face shifted as he read the name on the card. His eyes widened slightly, and he looked back at Serena with recognition. "Wait a minute. You're Mayor Serena Clark?" he asked, his tone filled with disbelief. "Yes, I am," Serena replied, her voice calm but firm. "And I've been trying to tell him that for the past 15 minutes. Daniels froze, his confidence shaken. "What?" he stammered, taking the ID back and reading it carefully for the first time. His face paled as the reality of the situation hit him. The second officer cleared his throat awkwardly. "Officer Daniels, I think there's been a misunderstanding," he said. Serena raised an eyebrow. "That's putting it lightly," she said, crossing her arms again. "Now, can I go inside and continue my meeting, or are we going to stand here all day?" Daniels mumbled an apology, but Serena didn't acknowledge it. The small crowd of onlookers murmured amongst themselves, many of them recognizing Serena now that her identity had been revealed. As she walked back toward the house, her head held high, Daniels stood frozen in place, realizing the enormity of his mistake. He could already feel the repercussions coming. But the story was far from over. The air was thick with tension as Serena Clark disappeared into the house, leaving Officer Daniels standing on the sidewalk, his confidence shaken. The neighbors who had gathered were whispering among themselves, their curiosity now laced with disbelief. Word spread quickly. This wasn't just any woman Officer Daniels had detained. She was the mayor of the city. Inside the house, Serena took a moment to collect herself. She wasn't angry, but she was deeply disappointed. Being mistaken for someone out of place was one thing, but being treated as if she had no right to exist in that space was another. She had always known the challenges that came with her position, but today's experience was a stark reminder of how much work still needed to be done. Meanwhile, outside, Daniel's radio buzzed. The voice on the other end asked him to report the situation, but he could barely muster a coherent response. "It's resolved," he muttered, avoiding eye contact with the second officer, who still stood nearby. "Resolved," the second officer repeated, raising an eyebrow. "Daniels, do you understand what just happened? You detained the mayor. Do you know how this is going to look?" Daniels rubbed his temples, feeling the weight of his actions pressing down on him. "I didn't know," he said defensively. "She wasn't dressed like a mayor. She didn't." The other officer cut him off. "It doesn't matter how she was dressed. You didn't listen to her, Daniels. That's the problem." As they spoke, the murmurs among the neighbors grew louder. A few of them had pulled out their phones, recording the aftermath. Daniels glanced around nervously, realizing this wasn't going to stay quiet for long. He had made a mistake, and it was becoming painfully clear that everyone knew it. Back inside, Serena sat down with the community leader she had come to meet. "Let's get started," she said, her voice calm but firm. She wasn't going to let the incident derail her day. They began discussing the housing reform plan, a project close to Serena's heart. It was a chance to provide affordable housing for low-income families and bridge the gap between Brookville's affluent and underserved communities. Despite her focus on the task at hand, Serena couldn't shake the thought of what had just happened. She knew this wasn't about one officer or one incident. It was about a system that allowed such assumptions to be made so easily. Her resolve to create change only grew stronger. Outside, Daniels remained rooted to the spot, his thoughts racing. He replayed the interaction in his mind, realizing how many times he had ignored Serena's explanations and dismissed her calm demeanor. The second officer, seeing his distress, sighed. "Look, Daniels," he said, "you messed up. Big time. But the least you can do now is own up to it. Go back inside and apologize." Daniels hesitated. Facing Serena again felt daunting, but he knew the other officer was right. Taking a deep breath, he walked toward the house and knocked on the door. When Serena opened it, her expression was unreadable. Daniels cleared his throat. "Mayor Clark," he began, his voice faltering slightly, "I want to apologize for how I treated you earlier. I didn't listen, and I made assumptions I shouldn't have. I'm sorry." Serena studied him for a moment, her sharp gaze making him shift uncomfortably. Finally, she nodded. "Thank you for apologizing, Officer Daniels," she said, "but apologies are only the first step. I hope you'll think about how you can do better in the future." Daniels nodded, the weight of her words sinking in. As he turned to leave, the neighbors began to disperse, their conversations still buzzing with the day's events. Serena watched him go, knowing this was just the beginning of a much larger conversation. Officer Daniels left the property feeling a mix of regret and embarrassment. He walked back to his patrol car, avoiding the curious stares of the remaining neighbors. The second officer, still standing nearby, gave him a small nod but said nothing. Daniels sat in his cruiser, staring at the dashboard. His thoughts were heavy, replaying the morning's events over and over. Serena returned to her meeting inside, determined not to let the incident ruin her day. The community leader she was meeting, Mr. Bennett, looked at her with concern. "Are you all right, Mayor Clark?" he asked, his voice full of respect. Serena gave a small smile. "I'm fine, Mr. Bennett. This isn't the first time I've been underestimated, and I'm sure it won't be the last. Let's focus on why we're here." The two dove into their discussion about the housing reform plan, mapping out strategies to present to the city council. Serena's passion for the project shone through. She had worked hard to become mayor, and she wasn't about to let one officer's assumptions distract her from her goals. Still, the incident lingered in the back of her mind. Meanwhile, back at the police station, the video of the encounter had already started circulating on social media. By noon, several local news outlets had picked up the story. Headlines like, "Mayor mistakenly detained by officer," and "Racial bias in Brookville police" dominated the news cycle. The police chief, Chief Harrison, quickly became aware of the situation. He called Daniels into his office. Daniels entered, his shoulders slumped. He had seen the videos and the comments online. People were angry, and rightfully so. Chief Harrison looked at him sternly. "Daniels, do you realize the damage you've caused?" he asked, his voice firm but controlled. "I do, Chief," Daniels replied, his voice low. "I wasn't thinking clearly. I let my assumptions take over." Harrison leaned back in his chair, studying the officer. "This isn't just about you, Daniels. This reflects on the entire department. You've put all of us in a difficult position. The mayor has already shown more grace than most would in her situation. You're lucky she didn't escalate things further." Daniels nodded, feeling the weight of his mistake more than ever. "What can I do to fix this, Chief?" he asked earnestly. Harrison sighed. "For starters, you're going to attend sensitivity and de-escalation training. You'll also participate in community outreach programs, but that's just the beginning. You need to earn back the trust you've lost, both with the mayor and with the people of this city." Daniels agreed, knowing it was the least he could do. He left the office feeling the enormity of the responsibility ahead of him. Back at City Hall, Serena was wrapping up her meeting when she received a call from Chief Harrison. "Mayor Clark," he began, "I want to personally apologize for what happened today. Officer Daniels is being disciplined, and we're taking steps to ensure incidents like this don't happen again." Serena appreciated the gesture but remained cautious. "Thank you, Chief," she replied. "But apologies and promises are only as good as the actions that follow. I'll be keeping a close eye on how your department handles this." Harrison assured her that changes were already being implemented. After ending the call, Serena took a deep breath. She had always believed in the power of using difficult moments to spark change, and this was no exception. That evening, Serena addressed the city through a televised press conference. She recounted the incident calmly, emphasizing the need for systemic reform rather than focusing on personal blame. "This isn't just about me," she said. "It's about creating a community where everyone feels seen, heard, and respected." Her words resonated with the city, igniting conversations about bias, accountability, and progress. The incident had been painful, but it became a catalyst for something much greater. And Serena, as always, was ready to lead the charge. The following day, the city was buzzing with discussions about Mayor Serena Clark's press conference. Her calm demeanor and strong words had struck a chord with people from all walks of life. News stations replayed her speech, and social media was flooded with posts praising her leadership. But Serena knew that public support wasn't enough. Real change required action. At City Hall, Serena met with her staff to discuss the next steps. "We have an opportunity here," she began, her voice steady but passionate. "The attention this incident has brought can be used to highlight the reforms we've been working on for months. Let's push forward with transparency and accountability initiatives for the police department." Her chief of staff, Marisol, nodded in agreement. "We could host community forums to allow residents to share their experiences with law enforcement. It's a chance for dialogue and understanding." Serena smiled. "That's exactly what I was thinking. Let's schedule the first forum for next week, and let's invite Chief Harrison to join us. His presence will show the department's willingness to work with the community." Meanwhile, Officer Daniels was starting his mandatory sensitivity training. The classroom was filled with officers, each listening to a speaker who shared stories about implicit bias and the importance of treating everyone with respect. Daniels shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but he forced himself to listen. He didn't want to make the same mistake again. During a break, another officer approached him. "Tough situation you're in," the officer said, "but it takes guts to face it head-on. Most people would try to avoid the spotlight." Daniels nodded, appreciating the support. "I messed up. I know that. But I want to make things right." That evening, Serena attended a dinner with community leaders, including Mr. Bennett, to further discuss the housing reform plan. As they ate, the conversation turned to the police department. One leader, a retired teacher named Mrs. Ellis, spoke up. "Mayor Clark, you handled that situation with such grace. But we all know that one apology isn't enough. What do you plan to do to ensure this doesn't happen again?" Serena placed her fork down and leaned forward. "Mrs. Ellis, you're absolutely right. That's why we're not stopping at apologies. The community forums we're organizing are just the beginning. I want to implement mandatory training for all officers and establish an independent review board to handle complaints against the police." The leaders exchanged approving glances. Mrs. Ellis smiled. "If anyone can make this happen, it's you." Across town, Chief Harrison was preparing for the community forum. He had spent the day reviewing the department's policies and identifying areas for improvement. He knew this was a pivotal moment for the police force. If they didn't show genuine commitment to change, they risked losing the trust of the people they served. As the first community forum approached, anticipation grew. Flyers were distributed, social media posts spread the word, and local news outlets announced the event. Serena and her team worked tirelessly to ensure everything was in place. When the day of the forum arrived, the turnout exceeded expectations. Hundreds of residents filled the auditorium, eager to share their stories and hear from their mayor and police chief. Serena stood backstage, taking a moment to reflect. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but she was ready. As the lights dimmed and the crowd settled, Serena stepped onto the stage, greeted by applause. She looked out at the sea of faces, a mix of hope, frustration, and determination. "Thank you for being here tonight," she began. "This is our city, and together, we can make it a place where everyone feels safe and respected." The forum marked the beginning of a new chapter for Brookville, a chapter built on understanding, accountability, and the unwavering belief that change was possible. The community forum was a full house. Residents from all corners of Brookville filled the seats, some standing along the walls when chairs ran out. The air was electric, a mix of anticipation and determination. Mayor Serena Clark stood at the podium, her gaze sweeping across the room. She felt the energy, the readiness for change, and it fueled her resolve. "Good evening, everyone," Serena began, her voice calm but commanding. "Thank you for coming. Tonight is not just about one incident. It's about creating a city where everyone feels valued and respected. Your voices matter, and tonight we are here to listen and learn." The crowd erupted into applause, setting the tone for what would be an emotional and productive evening. Chief Harrison sat nearby, looking a bit uncomfortable but committed. He knew this wasn't going to be easy, but he also knew it was necessary. The first speaker was a middle-aged man who shared a story about being unfairly stopped by police while walking home from work. His voice trembled as he spoke, but the audience encouraged him with nods and murmurs of support. Serena listened intently, taking notes and nodding in understanding. When he finished, she thanked him and promised his concerns would not be ignored. Next, a young woman stood up, holding her toddler in her arms. "I've always loved this city," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion in her eyes. "But sometimes, it feels like it doesn't love me back. I want my child to grow up in a place where she's not judged by the color of her skin." Her words resonated deeply, and Serena felt a lump in her throat. "Thank you for sharing," Serena said. "Your story is why we're here tonight. Change doesn't happen overnight, but together, we can create a better future for your daughter and for all of us." As the evening went on, more residents shared their experiences. Some spoke with anger, others with sadness, but all with a shared hope for progress. Chief Harrison finally stepped up to address the crowd. "I've heard a lot tonight," he began, his tone sincere. "And I know the department has work to do. We are committed to rebuilding trust and ensuring every officer upholds the values of respect and fairness." His words were met with cautious optimism. Some nodded in agreement, while others remained skeptical. Serena knew trust wouldn't be rebuilt in one evening, but it was a start. Toward the end of the forum, a young boy stood up, holding his father's hand. His voice was soft but clear. "I want to be a police officer when I grow up," he said. "But I want to make people feel safe, not scared." The room fell silent, touched by his innocence and honesty. Serena knelt to his level and smiled. "That's a beautiful dream," she said. "And when you become an officer, you'll be part of the change we're working toward today." As the forum wrapped up, Serena thanked everyone for their courage and honesty. "This is just the beginning," she said. "Your voices will guide us as we move forward." That night, as Serena returned home, she felt both the weight of responsibility and the flicker of hope. The forum had shown her the city's potential for unity and progress. It wasn't just about addressing one incident. It was about reshaping the community, one step at a time. And Serena was determined to lead that journey with integrity and heart. The morning after the community forum, Serena Clark sat in her office, surrounded by her staff. A sense of purpose filled the room as they reviewed the feedback and ideas collected from the event. The forum had been a success, but Serena knew this was only the first step in a long journey. Her team was ready to turn the community's concerns into actionable changes. "Marisol, what's the status on the independent review board we discussed?" Serena asked, her tone focused. Marisol nodded, flipping through her notes. We've drafted the proposal and identified potential members, including representatives from the community. If we move quickly, we can present it to the city council by next week." "Excellent," Serena replied. "Make it a priority. This board will be key to ensuring accountability and transparency within the police department." Meanwhile, across town, Officer Daniels was meeting with a group of community leaders as part of his outreach program. He listened as they shared their perspectives on policing and what needed to change. Daniels had been humbled by his experience and was determined to rebuild trust. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but he was willing to put in the work. One of the leaders, Mrs. Ellis, spoke directly to him. "Officer Daniels, you've made mistakes, but showing up here today says a lot. It's actions like these that can start to heal the divide." Daniels nodded. "Thank you, Mrs. Ellis. I want to do better, and I hope my actions can speak louder than my past." As the day went on, the ripple effects of the forum began to spread. Local news outlets highlighted the city's plans for reform, and social media was abuzz with conversations about the changes. Residents felt a renewed sense of hope, and many expressed their support for Mayor Clark's leadership. At City Hall, Serena received a call from Chief Harrison. "Mayor Clark, I wanted to thank you for including the department in the forum. It wasn't easy to hear some of the criticism, but it was necessary. I've already started implementing new training programs for the officers." Serena smiled, grateful for his willingness to collaborate. "Thank you, Chief. This is just the beginning, but I'm confident we can make meaningful progress together." Later that evening, Serena attended a neighborhood event hosted by Mr. Bennett. The atmosphere was lively, with families enjoying food, music, and conversation. Serena walked through the crowd, greeting residents and listening to their thoughts. Many thanked her for her efforts, while others shared their hopes for the future. One young woman approached her, holding her baby. "Mayor Clark, I just wanted to say thank you. The forum gave me hope that things can get better for my son." Serena bent down to smile at the baby, who giggled in response. "Thank you for sharing that with me," she said warmly. "Your son deserves to grow up in a city where he feels safe and valued. That's what we're working toward." As the night went on, Serena felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The challenges were far from over, but the community's support and resilience gave her the strength to keep going. In the weeks that followed, the city began to see the first signs of change. The Independent Review Board was established, new training programs were implemented, and the community forums became a regular event. While there were still hurdles to overcome, Brookville was moving in the right direction. Serena often reflected on the incident that had sparked this journey. What had started as a moment of misunderstanding and bias had turned into an opportunity for growth and unity. She knew there was still much work to do, but she was proud of how far they had come. As she walked into City Hall one morning, greeted by smiles and waves from staff and residents alike, Serena felt a renewed sense of purpose. Together, they were building a brighter future, one step at a time.